Welcome to another deep dive. Today we're going to be tackling some really complex and fascinating stuff. We're going to be exploring the work of Judith Butler, a philosopher who has really kind of shaken things up in how we think about gender and identity.
Yeah, for sure.
Have you ever felt like society kind of hands you this script for how to be male or female?
Totally. Yeah.
Well, Butler dives deep into that feeling, and we're going to be going along for the ride. So get ready to question like everything you thought you knew about who you are and how those ideas even got into your head.
It is pretty wild how Butler kind of like flips the script on how we usually think about gender.
Yeah.
In their book, Gender Trouble, they make this argument that gender isn't some like innate thing, like your eye color or something.
No.
It's not something you're just born with. It's actually something we actively do.
Okay, so gender is performance. That's the big idea we're talking about here.
Exactly.
But it's not like we're all just like faking it, right?
No, it's more subtle than just like putting on an act. It's about all those little everyday things we do that get linked to being male or female. Like the clothes we wear, how we talk, even how we sit.
Right.
All these little things add up to this big performance that we perceive as male or female.
So it's not like somewhere deep down there's this like true me that's neither male or female. It's more like the act of performing itself like creates that sense of a fixed identity.
That's exactly what Butler's arguing. They're saying that if you strip away the performance, the idea of some essential masculinity or femininity kind of falls apart. It's a really radical idea that challenges the very foundation of how we see ourselves.
I can see that. And it makes you think about all that pressure there is to perform your gender the right way.
Yeah, totally.
It's like society hands you a costume and tells you to play the part. Like, have you ever felt that pressure?
Oh, yeah, definitely.
Like in the way you dress or how you're supposed to act at work or even how you express your emotions?
For sure.
Butler would say that all those feelings are tied to this idea of gender as performance.
They use this really powerful analogy to illustrate this point.
Okay.
It's from Kafka's In the Penal Colony.
Oh, yeah.
Remember that story where they have this machine that like inscribes the law onto people's bodies? Well, Butler says gender isn't like that. It's not written on us from birth. It's something we're constantly doing in the world through our actions and how we interact with other people.
It makes you think about that whole sex versus gender thing.
Yeah.
We often hear people say that sex is biological and gender is social.
Right.
But does Butler even buy into that distinction?
This is where things get even more mind-blowing.
Okay.
Butler actually critiques that very distinction.
Wow.
They argue that this idea of biological sex determining your gender is actually part of a larger system that forces this really tight link between sex gender and who you're attracted to. Butler calls this the heterosexual matrix.
The heterosexual matrix. Okay, so what does that even mean? Is it basically saying that there are only two genders and they have to line up perfectly with your biological sex?
Right. And it's not just about like limiting the number of genders. It's about creating this hierarchy within that binary. Like man and woman have to be opposites, with one being dominant and the other being subordinate.
That's incredibly limiting.
Oh.
If you only view gender through this binary lens,
Totally.
you completely miss out on the amazing diversity of human experience. It's like trying to shove everyone into these two tiny boxes.
Yeah.
When there's this whole spectrum of ways to be.
And it's not just limiting. It can be really harmful, too.
Right.
Think about all the pressure to conform,
Yeah.
the bullying, the discrimination that people face when they don't fit into those narrow categories.
This makes me think about what Butler says about how questioning those norms, it's not just some intellectual exercise.
Yeah.
It has real consequences for people's lives.
Yeah, you're totally right. If you connect it to the bigger picture, it's about challenging systems of power. When we question the idea of this fixed natural gender binary, we start to open up possibilities for a world where everyone is free to be themselves.
And Butler points out how this idea of a unified feminist movement, it can actually be exclusionary too.
Right, definitely.
Because it assumes that there's this feminist we that speaks for everyone. And that can silence or marginalize the voices of people who don't fit neatly into that category.
It raises this really important question.
Yeah.
Can you really have a movement for social justice that's truly inclusive if it's based on these fixed identity categories?
That's a really tough question to grapple with. It seems like any truly inclusive movement would have to make space for a wide range of identities and experiences.
Absolutely. It's about recognizing that identity is complex and that our lived experiences are shaped by so many different factors.
So back to this idea of performance.
Yeah.
If we accept that gender is something we do,
Yeah.
does that mean we can just choose whatever gender we want? Like, are we all just actors free to play any role we want?
It's not quite that simple.
Oh.
Butler acknowledges that while performance can be this powerful tool for change, it's always happening within this context of existing social norms and power dynamics. It's like you're trying to change the ending of a movie. You can improvise, but you're still working with that pre-existing script.
So it's like we're actors, but we're born onto a stage with a set and a script that we didn't create.
That's a great way to put it. We can try to improvise, challenge the script, but those structures are always there, exerting their influence.
It's this constant back and forth, right, between those pre-written rules and our desire to create something new and authentic.
And that's where things get really interesting.
Yeah.
Because Butler argues that even within those constraints, we can find opportunities for resistance and change.
Okay, so how do we resist? If we can't just opt out of the performance altogether, how do we use it to challenge these norms and create new ways of understanding gender?
This is where their idea of subversive repetition comes in.
Yeah.
Butler suggests that by exaggerating or parodying gender norms or twisting them in unexpected ways, we can start to expose how artificial those norms really are and create new possibilities.
So it's not about rejecting the performance itself. It's about using it to show how fake and constructed those norms really are.
Exactly. Like, think about drag performances.
Hmm.
They take those gender stereotypes, blow them up to these huge proportions, and make us question everything we thought we knew about gender.
It's like holding up a mirror to society and being like, look how ridiculous this all is.
Right.
Yeah.
And that kind of questioning isn't just limited to the stage or these extreme expressions.
Okay.
Butler sees potential for subversion in everyday life, too.
Like what kinds of things?
Yeah.
Like wearing clothes that are traditionally associated with a different gender.
Exactly.
Or using language that challenges stereotypes.
Yeah. Even small acts like those can be really powerful. They disrupt that seamless performance and make those cracks in the facade of natural gender visible.
I love that idea. That we can find moments of resistance in the everyday. It's empowering to realize that we have this power to push back, even in small ways.
And those small acts add up. The more we challenge those norms,
Right.
the more we expose how constructed they really are, the more freedom we create for everyone to express themselves in authentic ways.
This brings up another question, though. If, as Butler argues, there's no fixed self behind our actions, where does our power to act, to make choices, actually come from?
That's a great question, and it gets to the heart of Butler's thinking. They argue that even if there's no fixed pre-existing self, the very act of doing gender, of repeating those gendered actions, creates the potential for change.
So instead of having this fixed identity that then acts,
Yeah.
it's the actions themselves, a constant repetition that open up the possibility of changing the script.
You got it. And it's within those repetitions, those tiny variations and disruptions of the norm, that our power to change things, to rewrite the rules, emerges.
It totally shifts how we think about who we are.
Right.
And how we can make a difference in the world, right?
Absolutely. It challenges us to rethink our most basic assumptions about identity and action. It can be mind-bending, but it can also be incredibly liberating.
All this talk about performance makes me realize that language isn't just this neutral tool for communication. It's a powerful force that shapes how we think about gender.
Totally.
How does Butler see language fitting into this whole construction of gender categories?
Language is really central to Butler's whole argument.
Okay.
The words we use, the categories we create,
Yeah.
the statements we make about gender, they all contribute to creating and maintaining those seemingly fixed identities.
So when we talk about man and woman,
Yeah.
like there are these self-evident, unchanging categories, we're actually reinforcing this idea that gender is just this natural binary.
Exactly. Language doesn't just reflect reality, it actively shapes it.
Wow.
This is where Butler sees both the problem and the potential for change.
So the problem is that language can be used to uphold these really oppressive systems. But the potential is that language can also be used to challenge and dismantle those systems.
Precisely. Language is a tool of constraint, but it's also a tool of possibility. And understanding how language shapes our world is so crucial if we want to create any meaningful social change.
It's amazing, though, that even though we're shaped by language and these social forces,
Yeah.
we're not completely determined by them. There's still this possibility to push back, to resist, to create something new.
That's a key takeaway. It's easy to feel powerless when we think about how embedded those social norms are in our language and in our culture. But Butler reminds us that there's always room for subversion. for challenging the script, for creating new meanings and possibilities.
It's particularly relevant when we're talking about gender.
Right.
If gender isn't fixed, if it's something we're constantly creating through our actions and our words, that means change is always possible.
And that potential for change is really exciting.
Yeah.
It means we're not trapped by those rigid, predetermined categories. We have the power to question, to challenge, to play with, and ultimately to subvert those norms. And by doing that, we create a more just and inclusive world.
It feels like the heart of Butler's work is about using this understanding of how gender is constructed to make the world a better place. It's about taking these ideas and putting them into action.
Absolutely. Butler's work encourages us to see ourselves as active participants in creating meaning and shaping our identities, not just passive recipients of what society tells us to be.
Okay, this is where things get really wild.
Yeah.
Buckle up.
Right.
If we accept that even the idea of a stable biological sex is a product of power and how we create meaning in our culture, what does that mean for how we understand our bodies?
This is where Butler's work gets really radical.
Okay.
They argue that even the body, something we often think of as the most natural and pre-cultural part of us, is actually shaped by discourse and power.
Wait, hold on. We usually think of our bodies as this fixed biological reality, but Butler's saying that even our understanding of our own bodies is influenced by social norms and expectations.
Exactly. They argue that the way we perceive our bodies, the way we categorize them, the way we experience them, it's not purely biological. It's filtered through this lens of cultural meaning. Think about it. The idea that there are only two sexes, male and female, with totally distinct characteristics, that's not a biological fact. That's a cultural idea that shapes how we understand our own bodies.
So it's not that biological differences don't exist at all. It's the meaning we give to those differences, how we divide those differences into male and female. That's culturally determined.
Yes, exactly. The body isn't just a blank slate that culture writes on, though. It's shaped by those cultural scripts, by the norms and expectations that tell us what's normal, what's natural, and what's acceptable.
So this makes me think about the pressure on people whose bodies don't fit neatly into those categories of male and female.
Yeah.
They're often pushed to medically or surgically alter their bodies to conform to those norms.
That's a perfect example of how this idea of a fixed sex plays out in the real world with real consequences. Bodies that don't fit the norm are often seen as problems to be fixed, and there's this immense pressure to make them conform.
So for Butler, understanding the body as something that's culturally constructed isn't just this theoretical debate. It has real impacts on how we see ourselves, how we understand our identities, and how we experience our own physicality.
Absolutely. It challenges us to question those categories that we take for granted, to see the body not as this fixed thing, but as something that's constantly being shaped and reshaped by these social forces.
It's revolutionary when you think about it. If we start to see the body as something constructed and changeable, it completely opens up how we understand gender, sexuality, even who we are as people.
And then that's where things get really exciting, because it means we have more agency than we might realize. We're not just passive recipients of these cultural norms. We're active participants in creating meaning and shaping our identities.
And within that participation, within those actions and performances that make us who we are, there lies this potential for resistance, for change, for creating a world that is more just and more liberating for everyone.
Absolutely. Butler reminds us that even within the constraints of those social norms and that language that we inherit, there's always space for subversion, for challenging the status quo, for creating new meanings and new possibilities.
It's a really powerful message.
Yeah.
That we're not just defined by these categories that we're born into. We actually have the power to shape and reshape those categories through our actions, our language, our way of being in the world.
It's a call to action, an invitation to engage in that process of subversion and redefinition, which can be both creative and transformative.
That's a challenge worth taking on, I think, because it offers us a vision of a future that's more just inclusive and liberating for all of us.
Absolutely. And it's a future that's possible if we're willing to challenge the status quo, to question our assumptions, and to embrace the radical potential of Butler's ideas.
Now, Butler doesn't shy away from the political implications of their work. They argue that questioning these gender norms, it's not just a personal thing or just an intellectual debate. It's a deeply political act.
They're absolutely right. Challenging that gender binary and the heterosexual matrix is about challenging systems of power and control. It's about creating space for new ways of being, of loving, of relating to each other.
So it's about more than just individual freedom. It's about social justice and collective liberation.
Butler reminds us that the personal and the political are always intertwined, and that challenging gender norms is ultimately about creating a more just and equitable world for everyone.
This leads to another big question raised by Butler. If man and woman aren't these natural fixed categories, what does that mean for the future of feminist politics?
This is where Butler's work gets really challenging and controversial, because they argue that feminist politics, which has often relied on this category of women as this unifying force, needs to be rethought.
So they're questioning the very foundation of feminist thought and activism.
In a way, yes. They're not saying that feminism is irrelevant or outdated, but that it needs to evolve and adapt to account for the complex realities of gender. We need to move beyond this simple binary understanding of gender and recognize the many ways in which people actually experience and express it.
So if we can't just rely on this category of women as this unifying concept, how do we build a feminist movement that is both inclusive and effective?
It's a challenge, but it's also an opportunity. It's a chance to create a feminist movement that truly reflects the diverse experiences and needs of all people.
So it's about moving beyond these narrow identity politics and finding new ways to build solidarity and connection based on shared values and goals.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that our struggles for justice are all interconnected. We need to work together to dismantle those systems of oppression that affect all of us, regardless of gender.
That's a powerful vision, and it feels especially relevant today as we're seeing these categories of man and woman being challenged and redefined all around us.
Absolutely. Butler's work gives us the intellectual tools we need to navigate these increasingly complex landscapes of gender identity and expression.
And to work towards creating a world that is truly just and equitable for all.
Exactly. A world where gender is no longer a source of oppression or limitation, but a source of creativity, freedom, and possibility.
And that's a world worth fighting for, a future worth building.
Absolutely. And it's a possibility that's within our reach if we're willing to challenge the status quo, to question our assumptions, and to embrace the radical potential of Butler's ideas.
Now, all this talk about performance might make it sound like Butler thinks we could just pick and choose whatever gender identity we want.
Right.
But that's not really what they're saying, is it?
You're right. Butler recognizes that while performance can be this powerful tool for change, it's always happening within these boundaries of social norms and expectations.
Okay.
We're not just individuals making choices in isolation.
Right.
Our actions and expressions are always shaped by the world around us.
So it's like we're actors on a stage.
Yeah.
But we're born onto that stage with a pre-existing set and script that we had no part in creating.
That's a perfect analogy. We can improvise and challenge the script.
Yeah.
But those structures are always there,
right,
exerting their influence on our performance.
It's this constant push and pull, right?
Totally.
Between individual agency and these social constraints.
So how do we navigate that tension then?
Yeah.
If we can't just choose to opt out of the performance altogether, how can we actually use performance to challenge those norms and create new possibilities for understanding gender?
This is where Butler's concept of subversive repetition comes in, right?
Exactly.
Can you explain what they mean by that?
They suggest that by exaggerating or parodying those gender norms, or even like recontextualizing them, we can expose how artificial they really are and open up space for different ways of being.
So it's not about rejecting performance entirely.
Right.
It's about performing in a way that reveals how constructed those norms are.
Exactly. Think about drag performance. It takes those exaggerated gender stereotypes and throws them right back in society's face, highlighting how artificial and performed those norms actually are.
It's like taking the tools of the system.
Yeah.
And using them to dismantle the system itself.
Exactly. And that kind of subversion isn't limited to the stage or to really extreme expressions of gender.
Okay.
Butler sees that potential for subversion in everyday life, too.
So, like, what kind of things are you talking about? Like wearing clothing that's usually associated with a different gender.
Right.
Or using language that challenges those stereotypes.
Precisely.
Yeah.
Even though small acts can be really powerful, they disrupt that seamlessness of the performance and reveal the cracks in that facade of natural gender.
I love that we can find those moments of resistance in the most ordinary things. It's empowering to realize that we're not just conforming to those norms.
Right.
We actually have the power to push back, even in small ways.
And those small acts add up. The
Yeah.
more we challenge those norms, the more we expose how they are constructed. And the more space we create for true freedom and self-expression.
So even though we're always performing gender within certain social limits,
Yeah.
we still have choices. We can still push those boundaries,
Mm.
and we can still create change.
Absolutely. And that's one of the most hopeful things about Butler's work. It means that we're not just victims of circumstance, we're active participants in shaping both gender and identity.
And we can create a world where those categories are less rigid, less limiting, and more open to the amazing diversity of human experience.
Exactly. That's the vision we should all be working towards. Absolutely. And that's a vision we should all be working towards.
Now, with all this talk about subversion and resistance,
Yeah.
it might sound like Butler's advocating for just this individual rebellion against any social norms, but that's not really what they're saying, right?
Yeah, you're right. Butler recognizes that we don't exist in isolation.
Okay.
Our identities are formed in relation to others, and our actions, they have an impact on everyone around us.
So it's not about just rejecting all social norms and expectations altogether. It's more about engaging with them in a critical and conscious way.
Precisely. This is where Butler's idea of ethical responsibility comes into play.
Yeah.
They argue that we have this responsibility to really think about how our actions affect others and to work towards creating a more just and equitable world.
So it's about more than just individual freedom then. It's about social responsibility and collective liberation.
Exactly. Butler's work is a reminder that our personal choices and actions are always intertwined with these larger social and political structures, and we have this responsibility to use our agency to challenge those structures and to create a more just world for everyone.
That makes me think about Butler's warnings about the limitations of identity politics. They argue that if we focus too much on individual identity categories, it can sometimes lead to more fragmentation and division rather than solidarity and collective action.
Yeah, you're right. While Butler doesn't completely dismiss identity politics, they definitely caution against its potential pitfalls. They suggest that we need to find ways to build coalitions and alliances across different identity lines based on shared values and common goals.
So it's about recognizing the importance of individual identities and experiences, but also recognizing that we need to go beyond those identities to create this broader movement for social justice.
Exactly. It's about connecting our personal struggles to those larger social and political movements and working together to dismantle those systems of oppression that impact all of us.
That's a really powerful vision, and it feels especially relevant in today's world, where we face so many challenges that demand collective action and solidarity.
Absolutely. Butler's work gives us the intellectual tools to understand and navigate these really complex and challenging times. And it helps us to work together to create a more just and equitable world for all people.
That's a goal worth striving for, a future we should all be working towards.
Absolutely. It is. And it's a future that we can achieve if we're willing to challenge the status quo, to question our assumptions, and to embrace the radical potential of Butler's ideas.
Now, Butler's work has been incredibly influential in both queer theory and activism. Do you talk a bit about how their ideas have impacted these fields?
Absolutely. Butler's work has really been fundamental to both queer theory and activism. Their ideas about how gender is a construct, how identity is performed, and how transgression can be a powerful tool for change have really resonated with queer folks who have long challenged the norms and expectations of a heteronormative society.
So Butler's work has provided this framework for understanding and challenging how that heteronormativity limits our understanding of both gender and sexuality.
Yes, Butler's ideas have helped shift the conversation away from this view of homosexuality as a medical problem that needed to be fixed or cured, to a much more celebratory and affirming understanding of queer identities and experiences.
So it's a shift from seeing queerness as something that's wrong to seeing it as a valuable and valid part of human diversity.
Exactly, and this shift has had a really significant impact on queer activism. It's given it a much stronger theoretical foundation for movements fighting for LGBTQ+ rights and liberation.
I could definitely see how Butler's ideas about gender performance have been really important here. This idea that gender isn't something we are, but something we do, opens up so many more possibilities for understanding both sexual orientation and gender identity in a much more fluid and expansive way.
Absolutely. Butler's work helps us break down those rigid categories of gay and straight, male and female, and make room for this much richer and more diverse spectrum of identities and experiences.
And that's been crucial for challenging discriminatory laws and policies, for creating more inclusive and affirming social spaces, and for really celebrating the beauty and diversity of queer lives.
Exactly. Butler's work has really been instrumental in the fight for LGBTQ plus equality, and their ideas continue to inspire and inform queer activism all around the world.
It's a good reminder that those struggles for queer liberation and gender justice are deeply connected. And they're both ultimately about challenging those systems of power and control that limit our freedom and our humanity.
Absolutely. And it's through our collective action, through our creativity, and through our unwavering commitment to social justice that we can create a world that is truly just and equitable for everyone, regardless of their gender identity or their sexual orientation.
That's a world worth fighting for, a future we should all be working towards.
Absolutely. It is. And it's a future that we can achieve if we challenge the status quo, question our assumptions, and embrace the radical potential of Butler's ideas.
I know Butler's work has been incredibly influential, but it has also received its share of criticism and controversy. What are some of the critiques people have raised about Butler's ideas?
It's important to acknowledge that Butler's work has been subject to many different interpretations and critiques. Some people argue that their emphasis on performance and construction downplays the material realities of sex and the body. They worry that Butler's ideas could lead to a kind of radical relativism where anything goes and there are no objective truths about gender.
So they're concerned that Butler might be erasing those biological differences between men and women.
That's one concern, yes. But it's important to remember that Butler isn't denying those biological differences. What they're saying is that those differences don't have inherent meaning in and of themselves.
Okay.
It's the social and cultural meanings that we attach to those differences that create these categories of man and woman and shape our experiences of gender.
So it's not about denying biology, but about understanding how culture shapes and interprets biology.
Exactly. Butler is arguing that we can't fully understand gender just by looking at biology. We have to consider this complex interplay of biological, social, and cultural factors that shape our identities and our experiences.
That makes sense. What are some other critiques of Butler's work?
Another common critique is that their writing is too academic and inaccessible to people outside of the world of academia.
I can see that some of Butler's writing can definitely be pretty dense and challenging.
For sure, Butler is a philosopher, and they're writing for a scholarly audience. But that doesn't mean their ideas are irrelevant or inaccessible to everyone.
So how can we bridge that gap then? How do we make these really complex ideas more understandable and relatable for people who might not have a background in philosophy or gender studies?
Well, conversations like this one can definitely help. We can break down those complex concepts, connect them to real-world examples and experiences, and just try to keep things engaging and interesting.
And we can also have some fun with it, right?
Yeah, totally.
We don't have to sacrifice intellectual rigor, but we can still explore these topics with a sense of curiosity and a spirit of playfulness.
Absolutely. Learning should be enjoyable, especially when we're talking about topics as fascinating and important as gender and identity.
And one of the things that makes Butler's work so compelling, I think, is that it's not just about understanding the world, it's about changing it. They give us this vision of a world where gender is no longer a source of oppression or limitation, but a source of creativity, freedom, and possibility.
That's a powerful vision, and it's definitely a future worth striving for.
Let's explore Butler's concept of the heterosexual matrix a bit more. We touched on it earlier, but this idea seems key to understanding how this rigid gender binary is enforced in our society. Can you unpack this concept for us a little bit more?
Absolutely. The heterosexual matrix, according to Butler, is this cultural framework or system that assumes this natural and inevitable link between our biological sex, our gender, and who we're attracted to. It basically operates on the assumption that there are only two sexes, male and female, and that those sexes are naturally attracted to each other.
So it's this underlying assumption that everybody is straight and anyone who deviates from that norm is somehow unnatural or disordered.
Exactly. And this assumption is so pervasive in our culture that we often don't even realize it's there. But it shakes everything from our laws and institutions to our language and even our personal relationships.
It's easy to see how limiting this matrix can be for how we understand gender and sexuality. If we're only seeing the world through this heteronormative lens, we miss out on the vast diversity and richness of human experience.
Absolutely. The heterosexual matrix forces us into these rigid categories and punishes those who don't conform. This can lead to discrimination, to violence, to a sense of shame for people who don't fit neatly into that mold.
And it even limits the freedom of people who do identify as heterosexual, because it tells them there's only one right way to be,
Yeah.
one normal way to experience love and express themselves.
You're exactly right. It restricts everyone's ability to explore their full potential and to create these really authentic and fulfilling relationships and communities.
So how do we challenge this heterosexual matrix? How do we dismantle it and create a more inclusive and just world?
It's a complex challenge for sure. But Butler suggests some really important starting points.
Okay.
They argue that we need to start by questioning those very categories of man and woman, by really exposing how they are culturally constructed and artificially imposed upon us.
So we need to recognize that these categories aren't natural or inevitable. They're actually created and maintained by history, by culture, by power.
Exactly. Once we start to see these categories as constructs, as something that we created, we can begin to imagine and create new possibilities for understanding and expressing both gender and sexuality.
It's about challenging those assumptions that are embedded in our language, in our institutions, even in our own ways of thinking about the world.
Absolutely. It's about understanding how powerful language is in shaping our reality, and using that power to create a more just and inclusive world.
This is where Butler's idea of subversive repetition comes into play again, right?
Yes.
It's about using performance to challenge those norms and create new possibilities.
Exactly. Subversive repetition is about taking those existing categories and norms and kind of turning them on their head,
Okay.
using them in ways that undermine their authority and create new meanings and new possibilities.
So it's not about rejecting performance altogether.
Right.
It's about performing in ways that challenge the status quo and open up those new possibilities.
Exactly. Like, remember drag performance. It takes those exaggerated gender stereotypes and uses them to show how constructed and performed those norms really are.
It's like taking the script that we've been given and rewriting it, creating new characters and new storylines.
Yes, and those subversive performances can be so powerful because they challenge our assumptions, they disrupt our expectations, and they open up these spaces for thinking and being in totally new ways.
And those seemingly small acts of subversion, those moments of disruption, can have a ripple effect and contribute to creating a more inclusive and just world for everyone.
They absolutely can. Challenging that heterosexual matrix isn't just about challenging gender norms. It's about challenging systems of power that impact every single one of us.
And that's why Butler's work is so important, so
Yeah.
timely, and so relevant to all the struggles for social justice that are happening around the world.
I agree. Their work gives us the intellectual tools that we need to understand and challenge those systems of oppression, so we can create a more just and equitable world for everyone.
That's a vision worth fighting for, a future we should all be working towards.
Absolutely. And it's a future that's within our grasp if we're willing to challenge those norms, question those assumptions, and embrace the radical potential of Butler's ideas.
Let's shift gears a bit and talk about the future of gender studies.
Okay.
Where do you see this field heading in the years to come?
It's a really exciting time to be working in gender studies because the field is constantly changing and evolving. And right now we're seeing this really interesting shift towards a more intersectional approach.
What do you mean by that? What is an intersectional approach?
It means recognizing the complex interplay of gender with other social categories like race and class and sexuality and ability.
So it's about moving beyond just a singular focus on gender and recognizing how it interacts with other forms of oppression and other aspects of identity.
Exactly. And we're also seeing this growing awareness of the global dimensions of gender and the importance of decolonizing gender studies.
Can you unpack that a little bit? What does it mean to decolonize gender studies?
It means challenging those Western biases that have often dominated the field and recognizing the many different ways in which gender is understood and experienced in different cultures and contexts around the world.
So it's about acknowledging those limitations of Western perspectives on gender and creating space for other voices and other ways of knowing.
Exactly. And we're also seeing more and more interest in the role that technology plays in shaping how we understand gender and identity.
Oh, that's interesting. Can you give some examples of how technology is impacting gender studies?
Sure, think about the rise of social media and online communities, or the development of new reproductive technologies, or even the advancements in artificial intelligence.
Right.
All of these things are having a profound impact on how we think about and experience gender.
And they're creating new challenges and new possibilities
Yeah,
for how we think about gender justice and gender equality.
absolutely. I think the future of gender studies really depends on embracing those new challenges and those new possibilities and continuing to push the boundaries of what we know and how we know it, and ultimately working together to create a more just and inclusive world.
And recognizing that this work is never really finished.
Right.
There are always new questions to ask, new challenges to confront, and new possibilities to imagine.
Exactly. Gender studies is a dynamic and evolving process of inquiry, of critique, of transformation.
It's a process that requires us to be open to new ideas,
Mm-hmm.
to challenge our own assumptions, and to embrace the complexity and sometimes even the contradictions of gender and identity.
And we have to do all of this with a sense of hope, a sense of possibility, and a deep commitment to building a more just and liberated world for everyone.
Before we move on, I want to touch on something that's really central to understanding Butler's work,
Okay.
and that's their focus on the body.
Yes, it's easy to think about gender as something that just happens in our minds. But Butler reminds us that it's always embodied. It's always rooted in our lived experiences as physical beings.
It's not just about how we think about gender. It's about how we experience gender in our bodies,
Mm-hmm.
in our movements,
Yeah.
in our interactions with the world around us.
Exactly. Butler's work encourages us to really pay attention to those embodied experiences, to how gender norms shape our relationship with our own bodies, and to the ways those norms can be challenged and transformed through how we use and experience our own bodies.
It makes me think about how certain bodies are often policed and disciplined to try and make them conform to those gender norms.
So, like,
Like the pressure on women to meet these very narrow standards of beauty and femininity, while men are expected to be strong and stoic and unemotional.
Exactly. And those expectations can have such a profound impact on our physical and mental health, on our relationships, and just our overall well-being.
It's not just about these abstract ideas. It's about real-life experiences, real bodies, real pain, and real joy.
Exactly. That's why it's so important to pay attention to the ways in which gender is embodied, to challenge those norms that limit our freedom and our well-being, and to create a world where all bodies are celebrated and affirmed for who they are.
That focus on embodiment is one of the things that I think makes Butler's work so powerful and so relevant. It's not just theory. It's about how we live our lives, how we move through the world, how we experience our own physicality and the physicality of other people.
And it's about seeing the incredible power and potential of the body as a site of resistance, of transformation, of creating new possibilities for being.
It's about recognizing how deeply our bodies are implicated in systems of power and meaning-making,
Absolutely.
and using our bodies, our voices, and our actions to challenge those systems and create a more just and equitable world.
Exactly.
This brings us to another really important concept in Butler's work,
Okay.
which is the concept of agency. How does Butler define agency, and how does it relate to this idea of gender as performance?
That's a great question. For Butler, agency isn't about having total freedom or control over our lives or our identities. It's about recognizing that potential for action and for change, even within those limitations that are set by social norms and power structures.
So it's about understanding that we're not just passively accepting those norms and those structures, but we can actually resist them. We can subvert them. And we can create something new even within those limitations.
Exactly. And that agency isn't something that we just have as individuals.
Sure.
It comes from our interactions with others,
Right.
from our engagement with those norms, and even from our physical actions and experiences in the world.
So instead of being about individual will or intention, it's more about how we collectively create meaning and possibility through our actions and our interactions with each other.
That's exactly right. And this is where subversive repetition comes back into play. It's about taking those existing norms and expectations and kind of using them against themselves to expose their artificiality, their limits, and their potential for change.
So we may not be able to completely escape those limitations of those gender norms, but we can still use those norms in creative and subversive ways to challenge the status quo and create those new ways of being.
Absolutely. That's such a powerful form of agency. It's a way of taking back our power and making change from within the very systems that are trying to control and define us.
This reminds me of Butler's point that those structures that constrain us can also be the very tools that we use for resistance and transformation.
It is a bit of a paradox, but it's a really important one. It means that even in the most oppressive of systems, there are always these openings, always opportunities for subversion and transformation.
And it's in those openings,
Yeah.
in those moments of subversion, in those moments of transgression, that we can start to see the possibility of a more just and equitable world.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And through our collective action, through our creativity, and through our unwavering commitment to social justice, we can actually make that possibility a reality.
Butler's work has been hugely influential in the field of queer theory and activism. Can you talk a little bit about how their ideas have impacted these fields?
Absolutely. Butler's ideas have been foundational to both queer theory and activism. Their arguments about gender as a construct identity, as something performed, and the subversive potential of transgression have resonated really deeply with queer folks who have long challenged the norms and expectations of a heteronormative society.
So Butler's work has provided us with a framework for understanding and challenging how that heteronormativity limits our understanding of gender and sexuality.
Exactly. Butler's ideas have helped to shift us away from this medicalized view of homosexuality, where it was seen as a pathology or a problem to be solved, to a much more celebratory and affirming understanding of queer identities and experiences.
So it's about shifting from a framework that sees queerness as something that's wrong or bad to one that celebrates queerness as this valuable part of human diversity.
Exactly. And this shift has had a major impact on queer activism. It's provided a really strong theoretical foundation for all those movements fighting for LGBTQ+ rights and liberation.
I can see how Butler's ideas about gender performance have been really central to that shift. This idea that gender isn't something that we are, but something we do, opens up a much more fluid and expansive understanding of sexual orientation and gender identity.
Absolutely. Butler's work helps us to break down those rigid categories of gay and straight, male and female, to make room for this much richer and more diverse spectrum of identities and experiences.
And this has been really crucial for challenging discriminatory laws and policies, for creating those more inclusive and affirming social spaces, and for celebrating the beauty and diversity of queer lives.
You're exactly right. Butler's work has been absolutely instrumental in the fight for LGBTQ+ equality, and their ideas continue to inspire and inform queer activism all over the world.
It's a powerful reminder that those struggles for queer liberation and for gender justice are so deeply interconnected, and that both are really about challenging these systems of power and control that try to limit our freedom and our humanity.
Absolutely. And through our collective action, through our creativity, and through our unwavering commitment to social justice, we can create a world that is truly just and equitable for everyone, no matter their gender identity or sexual orientation.
That's a world worth fighting for, a future we should all be working towards.
It is a future we can achieve if we're willing to challenge the status quo, to question our assumptions, and to embrace the power and potential of Butler's ideas.
Now, Butler's work has been incredibly influential, but it's also been met with a fair amount of criticism and controversy. Can you talk about some of those critiques?
Absolutely. It's important to acknowledge that Butler's work has been the subject of a wide range of interpretations and critiques. One common critique is that their focus on performance and social construction downplays the very real material realities of sex and the body. Some critics worry that Butler's ideas could lead to this kind of radical relativism, where anything goes and there are no objective truths about gender.
So they're concerned that Butler's ideas might erase those biological differences between men and women.
That's one concern, yes. But it's really important to remember that Butler isn't denying the existence of biological differences. What they're arguing is that those differences don't have some inherent meaning in and of themselves.
Okay.
It's the social and cultural meanings that we attach to those differences that create those categories of man and woman that we're so familiar with, and ultimately shape our experiences of gender.
So it's not about denying biology, it's about understanding how culture shapes and interprets biology.
Exactly. Butler's point is that we can't fully understand gender just by looking at biology alone.
Okay.
You have to take into account this complex interplay of biological, social, and cultural factors that shape our identities and our experiences.
That makes sense. Which are some other criticisms of Butler's work?
Another common critique is that their writing can be really academic and inaccessible to people who aren't already familiar with philosophy or gender studies.
I've definitely felt that way at times.
Right.
Butler's writing can be pretty dense and challenging to get through.
It can be. But it's important to remember that Butler is a philosopher, and they're writing for an academic audience.
Right.
But that doesn't mean that their ideas are irrelevant or inaccessible to everyone else.
So how can we bridge that gap then? How do we make these complex ideas more understandable and relatable to people who might not have that academic background?
I think conversations like this one are a really good start.
Yeah.
We can break down those complex concepts. We can connect them to real-world examples and personal experiences. And we can just try to keep things engaging and interesting.
And we can have some fun with it, too.
For sure.
We don't have to sacrifice intellectual rigor, but we can still explore these topics with a sense of curiosity and a spirit of playfulness.
Absolutely. Learning should be enjoyable, especially when we're talking about topics as fascinating and important as gender and identity.
One of the things that makes Butler's work so compelling is that it's not just about understanding the world.
Right.
It's about changing it. They present this really powerful vision of a world where gender isn't this source of oppression or limitation, but a source of creativity, freedom, and possibility.
It's a beautiful vision, and it's definitely a future we should all strive for.
Now, to circle back to something we talked about earlier, I want to explore Butler's concept of the heterosexual matrix a little bit more.
Okay.
This idea seems really crucial for understanding how this rigid gender binary gets enforced in our society. Can you unpack this concept for us a little bit more?
Of course. The heterosexual matrix, as Butler describes it, is this cultural framework, this kind of system that operates on the assumption that there is this natural and inevitable link between our biological sex, our gender, and who we're attracted to. It basically assumes that there are only two sexes, male and female, and that these sexes are naturally attracted to each other.
So it's this underlying assumption that everyone is straight, and anyone who doesn't fit into that norm is somehow unnatural or wrong.
Exactly. And this assumption is so deeply ingrained in our culture that we often don't even notice it's there. But it shapes everything from our laws and our institutions to the language we use and even our personal relationships.
I can see how limiting that can be to our understanding of gender and sexuality. If we're only viewing the world through this heteronormative lens, we miss out on so much of the richness and diversity of human experience.
Absolutely. The heterosexual matrix forces us into these really rigid categories and punishes those who don't conform. This can lead to discrimination, to violence, to a sense of shame for people who don't fit into that mold.
It even limits the freedom of people who do identify as heterosexual, because it tells them there's only one right way to be, one normal way to experience love and to express themselves.
Exactly. It restricts everyone's ability to truly explore their full potential and to create these really authentic and fulfilling relationships and communities.
So how do we challenge this heterosexual matrix then? How do we dismantle it and create a world that is more inclusive and just?
It's a really big challenge.
Yeah.
But Butler offers some really important starting points.
Yeah.
They argue that we need to begin by questioning those very categories of man and woman, by really revealing how they are culturally constructed and artificially imposed upon us.
So recognizing that these categories aren't natural or inevitable, but they're the products of history, of culture, of power.
Exactly. Once we begin to see those categories as constructs, as something that we created, we can start to imagine and create new possibilities for understanding and expressing both gender and sexuality.
So it's about challenging those assumptions that are embedded in our language and our institutions, even in our own ways of thinking about the world.
Exactly. It's about understanding the power that language has to shape our reality and using that power to create a world that is more just and inclusive.
And this is where Butler's idea of subversive repetition comes in again, right?
Yes.
It's about using performance to challenge those norms and to create new possibilities for understanding and expressing gender.
Exactly. Subversive repetition is about taking those existing categories and those norms and kind of turning them on their head, using them in ways that undermine their authority and create new meanings and possibilities.
So it's not about rejecting performance altogether,
Yeah.
but about performing in ways that challenge the status quo and open up those possibilities.
Exactly. Like, remember drag performance. It takes those exaggerated gender stereotypes and throws them right back in society's face.
Yeah.
It reveals how artificial and how performed those norms really are.
It's like taking the script that we've been given and rewriting it ourselves.
Yeah.
Creating new characters and new storylines.
Absolutely. And those subversive performances can be so powerful because they challenge those assumptions. They disrupt those expectations. And they open up those spaces for thinking and being in these completely new ways.
And those little acts of subversion, those moments of disruption, they can have this ripple effect and really contribute to creating a more inclusive and just world.
Exactly. Challenging the heterosexual matrix isn't just about gender norms. It's about challenging those systems of power that impact all of us.
And that's why Butler's work is so important today. So timely and so relevant to the struggles for social justice that are happening all over the world.
I agree. Their work gives us the tools we need to understand and to challenge those systems. Their work gives us the tools we need to understand and to challenge those systems of oppression,
Yeah.
so we can create a more just and equitable world for everyone.
It's a vision worth fighting for, a future we should all be working toward.
Absolutely. And it's a future that's within our grasp, if we're willing to challenge the status quo, question our assumptions, and embrace the radical potential of Butler's ideas.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into Judith Butler's work, what are some key takeaways you hope our listeners will hold on to? What's the most important thing to remember about Butler's ideas, and how those ideas can help us better understand gender and identity?
That's a great question. One of the most important things to remember is that gender isn't something that we just are. It's something we actively do. It's a performance, a series of repeated actions and expressions that create this illusion of a stable and consistent identity.
And recognizing that gender is performative can be incredibly liberating.
Totally.
Because it means we're not trapped in those predefined roles or expectations.
Right.
We actually have the power to question those norms, to experiment with different ways of being, and to express ourselves in ways that might not fit into those neat little boxes that society tries to put us in.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that we do have the power to make choices, even within those limitations, to challenge the norms and to create new ways of being.
And it's also important to remember that those gender norms and those expectations,
Yeah.
they aren't natural or inevitable. They're created by culture, by history, by power.
Exactly. They're reinforced by this complex web of social structures and institutions that Butler refers to as the heterosexual matrix.
And that matrix really limits our understanding of both gender and sexuality. It pushes us into these rigid categories, and it punishes those who don't conform.
It does. And it's important to understand that challenging those norms and working to dismantle that matrix, it isn't just about individual freedom, it's about justice and liberation for everyone.
It's about building a world where all people can thrive, no matter how they identify or express their gender.
Exactly. And Butler's work gives us the tools and the inspiration to do that.
So as we bring this deep dive into Judith Butler's work to a close, what's one final thought you would leave with our listeners? Something to ponder as they continue to think about these really complex and fascinating ideas about gender and identity.
Here's a question to consider. If gender isn't fixed, if it's something that we're always creating and recreating through our actions, our words, and our interactions with one another, what does that mean for how we understand ourselves and how we might build a more just and equitable world?
That's such a powerful question.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's one that each of us needs to really grapple with as we try to make sense of gender and identity in our own lives and in the world around us.
I agree. It's a question that can lead us to profound insights and transformative possibilities if we're willing to approach it with curiosity, with an open mind, and with a commitment to creating a more just and liberated world for everyone.